may be wondering, can you even make a bandage dress out of yarn? But the real question is, should you make a bandage dress continuously by hand using a cotton sports weight yarn? This is such a bad idea. What better way to campaign for world peace than to recreate yet another iconic movie costume item, namely the lavender Hervé Leger halter-neck dress worn by Sandra Bullock as Gracie Hart in Miss Congeniality. Swatching and sampling were of course a necessity, and little did I foresee how far down this rabbit hole I would fall. Truthfully, I wanted a mercerized cotton for this, but I couldn't find one in the right shade. I began with knitting since it tends to have more stretch and is closer to the original method. Yes, bandage dresses technically are knitwear. Alternating between stockinette and pearl rose definitely looked the part, but the single layer was far too sheer for such a tight-fitting dress. To remedy this, I turned to double knitting to create a double layer of fabric. Generally speaking, bandage dresses are knit in separate panels before being attached together, which makes a whole lot of sense. However, this knowledge also made the thought of merely replicating the technique seem at best uninspiring, and at worst a serious case of all work and no play. Do you know what doesn't make Jack a dull boy? 3D printing your childhood fashion dreams into reality one stitch at a time, not Frankensteining them together into a Real Housewives reunion episode. But I digress. As if doubling the amount of knitting time wasn't enough, I then ventured into the territory of inappropriately tiny needle gauges. Somehow this made little difference other than somewhat uneven stitches, so I went back to the recommended gauge of 3mm. After calculating the starting stitches for the front panel, I used a cast-on of the tubular variety, because what would be more appropriate for a double knit project? Admittedly, this was also right in the middle of my tubular cast-on obsession. Is it over yet? Probably not. I decided to work from the bottom up this time, as I was more certain about how the hem would look than the top edge. Eventually, I encountered a rogue stitch and felt it was still early enough to unravel and fix it, but then it hit me.
Who said?
Call me naive or simply ignorant, but this was the moment I discovered that double knitting is in fact a somewhat misleading term for knitting in the round flat. The sense of betrayal was only half of it. The other half was realizing just how massive a round it was. How I was going to pick these stitches back up again in the right order, who knew, but I had to try. Oh, and it also turned out that my initial stitch count was way off.
So here are my first 2 attempts, and obviously it was only meant to be 1, but here we are.
Rookie error? Well, hear me out.
This measured about 5 centimeters in total, so that's what I used to calculate this. But obviously that didn't work, and as you can see, it's way too long. So then I tried my second attempt, and I just fell short about 5 centimeters, which is a little ironic. So now I'm going to use both of these to calculate the actual length that I need, and hopefully I get it right this time.
In a nutshell, one can never underestimate the power of compounded stitch discrepancies. You might be wondering, why not crochet this project instead? Surely it would be much faster and, depending on the stitch, potentially less see-through, generally speaking. And I wondered that too, so I decided to cast off one of my samples and whip up a crochet sample using my then new favourite crochet stitch. Who needs sarcasm and a gun when you have the right hook?
I used the half double crochet waistcoat stitch. However, I compared it with my original knit sample and I definitely prefer the knit sample.
Technically, I could combine the double knit with the crochet transition. However, this would undoubtedly create an elasticity problem, or rather lack thereof, and given the duct tape fit of the dress, that didn't seem like a good option. Picture a lavender Michelin man. Now that's a Michelin-starred problem.
Those 3 rows alone, they basically amount to the same as 8 rows in the double knit. I am pretty gutted that the crochet didn't turn out better, because that really would have saved me so much time.
Clearly, none of these what-if experiments were actually working out, so I went back to double knitting. Disappointed? Sure. But more than anything, just imagining the sheer scale of work ahead felt like counting every grain of sand on a desert island, without any hope of actually being rescued. Okay, maybe taking out the provisional yarn cheered me up a little. Eons later, I had finished the first band of stockinette, a milestone for sure. I just had to implement some kind of separating line, for which I basically did some weird double pearl thing, and, well, it was too short.
I'm going to have to unravel all of this.
Having counted the number of bands on the original dress and multiplied the number by the length of my current work, things were looking as short as my waning patience. And to add insult to injury, undoing these rows was no walk in the park, because it had to be done stitch by stitch to avoid reopening the jaws of the megalodon round that lay just beneath the surface.
Dun 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 dun.
But as they say, the show must go on. That is until you break a leg. Wait, how does that?
Can we just take this into consideration? Because this has taken me forever. It is really nice to have a double layer. I don't know, maybe I will just continue. I don't think it looks that great to warrant how long it takes. I have one of two options, and I'm really tempted to just give up on this and just crochet everything, even if it's not as nice, even if it's not as stretchy, even if... No, I might regret that. That being said, I've done many things that haven't been necessarily worth it, but if I were to get to the very end of it and realize that it just didn't fit right...
Okay.
I basically spent the best part of an evening trying to figure out what kind of transitional rows I wanted to make, and these are the two that I've settled with. Well, it's only one, I just repeated it. Actually, let me explain what happened. When I first started this project, I did have in mind the possibility that this project would actually need to be done with Tunisian crochet. Even though we have what looks like pearls at the back and we have what looks like stockinette at the front, this is done with my crochet hook. And obviously I'm having some tension issues, so I'm just going to keep sampling until I get something that's consistent enough that I can actually calculate the number of stitches I need. It's definitely not as stretchy, but it does have that coverage that I'm really looking for.
Okay, that was a lot, and don't worry if you didn't catch any of it, because there's more. I thought about not even including this because the footage was just an incredibly lengthy and mostly incoherent rant, but since it was such a huge part of this project, I didn't feel like I could leave it out.
Here's all my sampling so far, and I noticed that I have a real problem with curling, so that was a little concerning. These two were my first samples. This sample turned into this giant sample that I just went through, and this one is my latest sample. I started off using a 3mm hook. This is also 3mm. Then I switched to 4mm, and the top one is 5mm. It doesn't affect the coverage all that much. The 5mm one is a little more lacy.
I'm not actually a fan of using the word lacy to describe the sheerness of fabric, but both holey and meshy have their own problems. Help.
But what I did notice was that the 4mm hook looked the nicest, in my opinion. And then I noticed something really interesting. This is double knit, and this is Tunisian crochet, and it's so cool to see how similar they look. But obviously, if you flip them over to the other side, they look entirely different. The double knit has a lot more stretch. So if I compare this stretch to this, you can definitely feel the difference. It's still a lot more than the waistcoat stitch. I think the Tunisian crochet is just the best of both worlds, and if you've never done Tunisian crochet before, I definitely recommend it. This is also my first time.
Long story short, Tunisian crochet was the perfect in-between. It looked just like knit, but it wasn't knit. It had the fullness and reliability of crochet without some of the limitations of conventional crochet stitches. Everything was beginning to look a lot more optimistic all of a sudden, and the crushing weight of the workload was still crushing, but just not as much.
If it looks like a mess, it's because it is. Last night, I spent 2 to 3 hours working on this, and the good news is that the measurements check out, so I'm really happy with that. The bad news is there's a lot of bad news, unfortunately. So the biggest issue, and you can see that pretty clearly, is the curling. And if you're wondering what this random piece of yarn is doing, I actually tried slip stitching the chain into the first row to kind of combat that curl, and you can see that it kind of works a little bit, but it doesn't do a great job. Obviously, I could block this and see how it goes, but to be honest, I don't really want to risk it if it doesn't end up staying. And I recently discovered that usually with Tunisian crochet, you should go up 2 sizes and not just 1. Even though the stitch number and the measurements work out together, it doesn't matter anymore. Anyway, while I was researching tension and curling for Tunisian crochet, I also found out that there is a pearl stitch, and of course there's a pearl stitch. That makes so much sense. So I decided to try that out because apparently it would help a bit with the curling at the bottom. It's basically more cohesive with the rest of the fabric, and honestly it just makes more sense because it's Tunisian crochet. Why wouldn't I just use Tunisian crochet the whole time? I think I'm going to start all over again.
Remember those nightmares of being chased, but every time you try to run, you just jump up into the air and float back down again as if you're on the moon? First of all. Second of all, that's what this felt like, except the landings weren't so soft. This time round, I pearl stitched the first row into the top loop of the chain to combat the curl. I didn't crochet into the back because there was no way my giant 5mm hook was going to fit through those tiny little loops. Many hours later, this happened. It was beautimous, and it was everything I could have wished for and more. Chuffed does not even begin to describe the relief, let alone the realization that one really could have it all, at a great cost, but nonetheless. I was no longer cursed to eternity as a legend of the woman whose ghost can still be heard double knitting on some haunted isle north of a small fishing village.
There is still a bit of curl. Ideally, I wouldn't have any, but this is Tunisian crochet, so there will be some.
Looking back, I'm not sure if the curl was actually any better at all. It was hard to tell.
So all in all, pretty happy with everything so far. So I'm just going to continue straight for maybe a couple of bands, and then I'll start decreasing.
The technique was still unfamiliar enough to lead to missed stitches.
This keeps happening. If I wanted to do a decrease, this would look pretty good, but I don't. I'm gonna have to frog this.
There was so much work to do, and it was not without its hiccups. So what am I even saying? Well, to the untrained eye, the cast on and cast off look pretty much the same mid-row. Couple that with an incredibly fickle attention span, and you end up with this. I actually frogged for a completely unrelated reason, and I'm so glad I did. The saying that the devil's in the details had never made more sense. At this point in time, I'd already been working on this dress on and off for a couple of months, and it was coming up to the end of the year. Of course, as knitters and crocheters, we all know by now that it's not necessarily about the destination, but the journey, for the most part at least. And this got me thinking, which one was this project about? And regardless of which matters most, did I also have to enjoy it? Although pretty straightforward in concept, this project took me down paths I didn't expect, and I can't exactly say that all of it was fun. That being said, it inevitably pushed me to explore the unfamiliar and question how much I was willing to commit to an idea and technique, despite the consequences, good or bad. Even as I edit this video, I can still feel the sense of dread throughout certain moments, but more than that, I feel a real sense of satisfaction from having persevered through it, all for a bandage dress. Are you serious? The steepest climb was finally over, and all that was left was to make everything to the right measurements, both width and lengthwise. Or so I thought. Since Tunisian crochet was still brand new to me in practice, there were a few things I didn't know to look out for. Admittedly, it doesn't look too great so far. It's dragging a lot. So I basically messed up the tension a bit with these last stitches, and that was because I found it kind of difficult to kind of go back and cast off everything. So that is a bit looser than it should be, and therefore it is also a bit longer than it should be. Look, I'll say it like it is. I can see the potential, and hopefully you can too. But this was catastrophic. Those camera angles also had me fooled. How did this happen? Where did it all go wrong? Why? So to answer our initial question of should you make a bandage dress continuously by hand with a sports weight yarn, at this moment in time, the answer is probably no. Now, I'm sad to say it, but I'll have to leave things here for the time being. But don't worry, this is not the end, and I will be back with what I hope to be the finished garment. Thank you for jumping down the rabbit hole with me, and I shall see you again very soon.